She sang and smiled as she entered the stage, but there was a narrative no one really understood behind that sparkling voice. For more than 50 years, Miss Country Soul, Jeannie Seely, stood proudly under the opulent old Opry lights. But now that she's 90, she's exposing what those lights never revealed. Wearing a miniskirt on a platform that wasn't prepared for women like her required strength, and there were discreet betrayals and secret conflicts. She used to follow the unwritten rules, but that is no longer the case. At last, Jeannie is expressing her truth, and it's not always pleasant. No standing ovation can compare to the impact of her remarks on the Opry, country music, and her personal journey. Because Jeannie Seely is at last prepared to be heard for the first time in her lengthy, dazzling career. And everything will alter depending on what occurs next. Prior to the rhinestones, the lights, and the magnificent old Opry stage, Titusville, Pennsylvania, was one of them. Nestled in the state's northwest, this sleepy town is more well known for its oil rigs than for country music. However, Jeannie Seely was born in 1940 into a modest working-class family that was always involved in music. Her folks weren't well known. Even though her home was little, the young girl's hopes were already overflowing. Jeannie was performing on the local radio by the time she was 10. Her voice was little but distinct. Even so, she had knowledge that most adults did not. She was a stage girl. However, dreams don't cover expenses. After graduating from high school, she worked at a bank before relocating to California in the early 1960s, primarily to pursue opportunities rather than sunlight. She typed out contracts during the day and wrote songs at night while working as a secretary at Liberty Records. The stars began to align at that point. Country music legend Dottie West ended up with one of her songs, Leavin' and Saying Goodbye. Subsequently, there were more trims, co-writes, and slightly open doors. But Jeannie wanted to sing her own stories, not merely work behind the scenes. Then came 1966. Don't Touch Me, a seductive song she recorded that year, not only rose to the top of the charts, but also opened doors. She received a Grammy for Best Female Country Vocal Performance, and the song peaked at number 2 on the Billboard Country chart. In the history of country music, she was only the third female recipient of that honor. Jeannie Seely transformed from a songwriting girl to the woman everyone is talking about in an instant. But there was a cost to success. Some in Nashville greeted her backstage. Others spotted an outsider as they examined her from head to toe. She was not from a dynasty in the South. She didn't play sweet or wear pearls. She was independent, had a swagger in her voice, and a spark in her eye. Nevertheless, the Grand Ole Opry took notice and in 1967 gave her the most sought-after invitation in country music, a cast spot. It was a dream come true for Jeannie, but she was unaware of the price she would pay because the same qualities that made her unique would also make her controversial. Her voice wasn't the only thing that made headlines when she made her stage debut at the Opry, and she wasn't the type of woman they were used to. So did her skirt. Legends had walked the gleaming floorboards of the Grand Ole Opry stage, but when Jeannie Seely officially joined in 1967, she accomplished something no woman had ever dared to do before. Her skirt was a miniskirt. The skirt wasn't particularly fancy. By Hollywood standards, it wasn't even ostentatious. But it was as if someone had placed a firecracker in the front row on the Opry stage, where tradition hung heavy and women still wore long gowns and heels. The audience erupted in gasps. Some scowled, while others clapped. And the rumors were immediate backstage. Ladies don't dress like that. She won't stay here. Jeannie, however, did not recoil. She had no intention of making a statement. All she was doing was being Jeannie. Modern, self-assured, and unrepentant. The same woman who had fought her way out of a little village, who had earned her spot with a Grammy-winning voice, and who had worked as a secretary while penning songs that won awards. She has no intention of becoming smaller in order to appease others. Still, she was marked by the moment. Years later, when interviewed, Jeannie would make fun of it and refer to it as a skirt. However, she also acknowledged the expense. The animosity behind the scenes increased, but the Opry never publicly chastised her. They weren't accustomed to or completely at ease with her as a performer. In the late 1960s, the Opry continued to adhere to its old guard philosophy. It was common for female singers to be expected to blend in with the background, sing lovely tunes, and smile pleasantly. Jeannie, however, did not meet that description. She made jokes. She expressed her opinions. She wore whatever she liked. The establishment didn't always enjoy her tunes, and they weren't always nice. Little things started to catch her attention. Male musicians will have the best performance slots. Some press releases omitted her name. Backstage, there were cold shoulders, but Jeannie didn't back down. She threw herself into it because she would break the rules till they were broken if the industry didn't stop her. And they did, slowly. She established herself at the Opry, gaining admiration and standing ovations. However, that initial controversy made a lasting impression. She would always be that girl in the miniskirt to some. Even though male musicians were praised for their audacity, Jeannie was frequently viewed as challenging, demanding, or unladylike, regardless of how many records she sold or how many stages she lit up. She was attempting to survive in a system that wasn't designed for women like her, not to create a battle. Jeannie Seely questioned the Opry's implicit standards for women's conduct, speech, and performance in addition to its clothing requirement. And that silent act of defiance turned out to be a game-changer for both her career and country music in general. But the actual conflicts? They were about respect, not about attire. And Jeannie could see how much of that was kept for other people behind the Opry's velvet curtains. The Grand Ole Opry was a living museum of Nashville history, Southern charm, and music legends to the outside world. To get a sight of its renowned stage, people journeyed thousands of miles. It was sacred to fans. For Jeannie Seely, however, it was a completely different matter. The backstage area behind the Ryman stage's recognizable barn doors and bright circle of wood was tense, silent, and hierarchical. Within the seats, the Opry might have appeared to be a family, but within the dressing rooms, it frequently felt like a Cold War. Early on, Jeannie recognized the divide. Favorites, untouchables, and performers who received media attention, primetime slots, and red carpet treatment were all in place. Then came the others. Press announcements and history books hardly ever mentioned those who quietly kept the show going. What about women? Almost always, they fell into the second group. One song every night was permitted for some. They weren't supposed to steal the show, but to add some new elements. Jeannie saw brilliant female performers being politely pushed aside to make place for male headliners or ignored in favor of younger, more attractive newbies. She never publicly criticized it. Not in those days. She was unable to pay for it. Jeannie was already treading carefully as a woman with thoughts in a game that was dominated by men, and speaking too loud could result in fewer invites, radio plays, and shows. She continued to appear and smile, but she was also observing and recalling. She saw that the Opry consistently booked its male veterans, honored them as legends, and preserved their legacies. However, women were rarely given the same respect. They would frequently vanish without warning. Knowing their names and their experiences, Jeannie made a silent promise to never become one of them. Nevertheless, the same pattern kept happening as the years passed. Older performers, particularly women, were gradually pushed out of the spotlight while younger talents were introduced with fanfare. It was carried out in silence rather than with cruelty. It was dubbed the slow fade by Jeannie. You just stopped receiving calls. You weren't fired. She also occasionally felt as like she was fading, even though she was standing among the legends. The 1980s and 1990s saw a transformation in country music. The Opry started to change along with it, as it became glossier and more commercial. Jeannie adjusted by changing her appearance and singing new songs. The new Nashville machine, however, did not include her. The industrial games were never played by her. She was therefore excluded from them. But she persisted. Week after week, year after year, Jeannie continued to perform. Long after many of her peers had retired or died, and long after the press had moved on. Even though the stage didn't always love her back, she continued to travel down those backstage hallways, smiling nicely at the politics she didn't enjoy. And decades later, with steel still in her back and wrinkles on her face, Jeannie would at last start talking freely. Recounted what she witnessed behind those curtains, not with resentment, but with honesty, as she had earned the right to share her experience after living through the Opry's quiet for a lifetime. Heartbreak has long been a theme in country music, but for Jeannie Seely, it extended beyond the stage. It was genuine, unvarnished, and frequently awaited her as soon as the curtains closed. Jeannie married the world-famous composer Hank Cochran in 1969. With Grammys, successes, and a history together, They were a power couple in country music, but it was tumultuous behind the scenes. Hank was troubled yet clever. There was pressure in the marriage along with passion, high standards, long nights, and two artists entangled in each other's shadows while fighting to maintain their individual identities. Jeannie hardly discussed it. Although she didn't often discuss her personal difficulties in public, she eventually acknowledged that love can still be painful, even when it is genuine. And when the relationship ends, the suffering doesn't always stop. After their marriage finally failed, Jeannie was forced to deal with the fallout on both an emotional and professional level. She did not disintegrate after the divorce. She immersed herself in the music, performing, writing, recording, touring, and doing whatever else to stay afloat. But as the cheering subsided, loneliness began to creep in. The industry changed rapidly. You're the rising star one minute. The next, you're a well-known name, but you're not the one who gets calls from large labels or radio stations. The decline from relevance can be particularly harsh and icy for women. Jeannie sensed it, too. She observed her peers, Loretta Lynn, Patsy Cline, and Dottie West, dealing with their own forms of industry isolation and personal struggles. A few were taken too soon. A few quietly faded. Some fought invisible demons. What about Jeannie? She persevered. In certain years, the spotlight waned. The Opry hardly called for years. There were years when she would feel like a ghost of the woman who once startled them in a miniskirt as she passed through the backstage hallways. But the music was never an issue, so she continued to show up. There was quiet. Her personal life also got calmer offstage. Friends died. Partners in love came and went. She was a single woman. She never pleaded for pity, but there was a weight she couldn't entirely conceal. She made references to it in interviews. She showed it in her songs. She famously remarked, "I've sung about every kind of heartache you can think of. However, the hardest kind is the one for which you lack words." She never lost her passion, though. She refused to be pitted, even as she grew older. She proudly flaunted her independence. And gradually, that fortitude turned into her second legacy, as a survivor as well as a singer. She remained a lady who didn't need to get married to a producer, change her image for the charts, or quietly disappear into the background. Even when no one expressed gratitude, even when the phones ceased ringing, and even when the doors ceased to swing open. Because country music was more than just a job to Jeannie. It was vital to her. She was still engaged in a private battle to maintain her visibility, though. And whether Nashville was prepared or not, that conflict would appear in the next chapter of her life. The majority of country music performers had already said goodbye by the time Jeannie Seely reached her 50s. The inevitable outcome was retirement, obscurity, or small cameos. Jeannie, however, had no desire to fade into the past. She was just getting started, if anything. The industry often overlooked the fact that Jeannie's success was not only based on her talent. Grit kept her alive, silently. Even though no major label was requesting them, she continued to write, record, and put her heart into every lyric behind the curtains of fame. She also developed into an advocate, something that few artists of her generation dared to do. With caution at first, Jeannie started talking about how older performers, particularly women, were treated and how the Opry had turned into a venue for newcomers. Veterans were gently placed on the bench. She saw how women were supposed to stay perpetually 29 or vanish completely, but males were praised for aging gracefully. She also didn't keep quiet about it. Jeannie, however, did not demonstrate or march. She made use of her presence, which was her most potent weapon. She continued to appear every week, not just for milestone appearances or once a year for an anniversary event. At the Opry, Jeannie took the stage, ready to sing like it was her first night, decked out in rhinestones. What about the audience? They took note. Once again, there were standing ovations. Younger fans noticed something more profound because they were not familiar with her early hits. A woman who had persevered. A living document of the nation's past. New chapters are still being written. Nevertheless, the establishment surrounding her was sluggish to adapt. Decades passed before the Opry recognized Jeannie's transformation. The female member with the longest tenure in its history. A record that resulted from pure constancy, from persistent, gorgeous tenacity, rather than from high-charting singles or continuous media buzz. But there were battles that went unnoticed behind those triumphs. She overcame health scares, hospital stays, periods when she wasn't sure if she would return to the stage, and moments when she didn't have the energy, but she persisted. Something inside her wouldn't let go, not because she had to. Then, the emotional wounds were there. Friends vanished from the queue, and she observed. She witnessed the making and breaking of promises. She occasionally had the impression that she was performing to remind the Opry that she was still present, not only to get applause. Worth keeping in mind, it was still an important name. Jeannie never lost her voice, though, despite all the silence she had to endure. She began putting together her own recordings. Younger artists who recognized her reputation started working with her. Furthermore, she wasn't treated like an antique. She attracted a new following of women from all generations who recognized themselves in her, in addition to country music lovers. Strong, older, unrepentant, genuine, and, perhaps most importantly, she started speaking out in interviews, revealing the details she had previously kept private about ageism, erasure, and being viewed as difficult for only requesting equitable treatment. It was insight, not bitterness, the sort that only comes after a lifetime of refusing to back down. And Jeannie demonstrated something strong throughout it all. It's not always easy to succeed. The main story sometimes starts in the second chapter. The Grand Ole Opry that Jeannie Seely entered in 1967 is not the same as the one she enters today. The lights are still warm, the stage is still there. However, there are more varied, younger, and louder voices than ever before resonating through the pews. It's progress to some. Others see it as a loss of custom. But it's complicated for Jeannie. The transition from dusty vinyls and AM radio to digital streaming and TikTok smashes was something she witnessed firsthand. She saw up-and-coming talents ascend more quickly than ever before and occasionally fall just as fast. Quietly, she wondered. Some veterans reacted angrily when the Opry started bringing in newer, more pop-influenced acts, as if the country music she dedicated her life to was being rewritten without footnotes. Jeannie, however, did not. Change was not a threat to her. She believed it was essential, but she was troubled by the ease with which the past was being forgotten. She observed that some producers saw aging as a liability and that younger musicians weren't always taught the names of those who helped pave the road, because some fans believed that anything above 30 was out of date. She referred to this forgetfulness of roots that country music, more than any other genre, was meant to respect as musical amnesia. But she remained polite. She supported musicians like Carly Pearce, Mickey Guyton, and Casey Musgraves, women who, like Jeannie, were defying national conventions in their own unique ways. She recognized herself in them, their bravery, their sharp edges, and their resistance to confinement. However, she also noticed how little had changed. Despite its progress, the Opry still rarely gave older women the recognition they deserved. Radio continued to favor men, and festivals continued to book men 3-1. Yes, Jeannie was hailed, but only because she refused to go away. What about the others, who lacked her fire and endurance? In Nashville, there's an ancient proverb that goes, "They love you until they don't." Jeannie experienced that truth, but she chose to use it as fuel rather than allow it to harden her. She started being more open in interviews. She talked about how women had been disregarded by the Opry for decades, how they were hardly ever allowed to host, and how they still frequently had to work twice as hard to receive half the credit. However, her voice was devoid of resentment. Only truth, and gradually the Opry started to pay attention. Jeannie turned into an intergenerational link. She asked up-and-coming performers to perform. She served as their mentor. She reminded everyone that age is irrelevant in country music by sharing dressing rooms with people as young as 22 and as old as 82. It's about soul, honesty, and narrative. And just by being there, she started a silent revolution. Because there, in the midst of a changing business, stood a woman who had seen it all, the rejection and revival, the radio silence, the rhinestones, and who, despite their attempts to take away her seat at the table, never once moved. The Opry is still evolving and attempting to strike a balance between the past and the present. However, Jeannie Seely reminds everyone that tradition isn't about remaining the same every time she takes the stage. It's about keeping in mind your origins while moving forward. Jeannie Seely is 90 years old and no longer requests permission. Her hair is silver, her eyes are wise, and her voice is fiery as she enters the Grand Ole Opry stage. The Titusville girl is long gone. What's left is a lady who has outlived most of her contemporaries, outlasted decades, and consistently exceeded expectations. Not because she regrets anything, but because she no longer dons the miniskirt that caused controversy in the 1960s. The shock factor is simply no longer necessary for her. Respect is commanded just by her appearance. Each wrinkle has a story to tell. Her voice bears the weight of decades in every phrase. Jeannie has shown herself in ways she never dared in the past few years. She has talked about her unhealed scars, ageism, sexism, and the times she was undervalued and ignored. She tells these tales, however, not to vent, but to educate and demonstrate to others that you can be quiet and still make a big impression. Her recent performances are declarations rather than merely concerts. Jeannie doesn't try to sound 25 or conceal her age. She sings with emotion, truth, and history. She asserts that this has greater power than any location on the chart. At last, she is being acknowledged as more than just a survivor. She is a matriarch, a pillar, and an example of perseverance and dignity. She has accomplished all of this without ever really being the industry's darling. She previously remarked, "I wasn't the easiest choice, which is why I got here. I didn't leave, therefore I ended myself here." She's not slowing down at 90. She is simply speaking the truth. At last, in full, and without regret. Background fade was never intended for Jeannie Seely. She stood where legends stood for more than 60 years. Occasionally commended, ignored at times, but standing all the time. Through rejection, heartache, rebirth, and rebirth. She persevered because music was her identity, not because she was famous or received praise. She also refused to leave the stage, even when everyone else was looking away. Week after week, year after year, Jeannie's sheer presence made the country music industry remember her despite its tendency to forget. She just persevered. She didn't follow trends or plead for attention. In doing so, she elevated herself to the status of she now represents more than just music, and it is impossible to remove. She is evidence that growing older does not mean that a woman can stop inspiring and speaking up. Don't shrink to accommodate it, yet still command the room. There is more to her tale than just country music. It's about perseverance, dignity, and never allowing other people to determine your value at 90. She still has everything to say and nothing to prove. She once used a miniskirt to break down barricades. She now speaks her truth, breaking the quiet. And one thing is really evident throughout it all. Not only did Jeannie Seely make it through the Grand Ole Opry, she merged with its spirit.